All right, welcome to class. This is Introduction to American Political Ideas. My name is Ken Hicks, and we've been covering conservatism. We're going to continue our discussion of conservatism today with a kind of contemporaneous presentation of a phenomenon that we've been witnessing over the last couple of really less than 6 months. And that is sort of the emergence of what has been described by some as an authoritarian technocracy movement. This is not kind of a characterization of the entire high-tech industry. It is really, kind of a faction within the high-tech industry. I have no interest in trying to paint the entire, a very vast industry that now is no longer entirely centered in Silicon Valley. There are nodes in Texas, in Georgia, in New England. But this was a particularly influential movement that played a fairly important role in the 2024 presidential election. So what are we going to learn about today? We're going to talk about sort of the origins of the high-tech industry. We're going to talk a little bit about the factionalization and concentration that has occurred in the high-tech industry over the course of the last really 20 years or so. We're going to spend a good deal of time talking about the intellectual influences of some of the particular group, factions within the Silicon Valley and the high-tech industry that we're talking about. We're going to talk a little bit about what authoritarian technocrats want. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how authoritarian technocracy really reflects some sort of coherent ideology. It's important to keep in mind in this class that these ideologies that we talk about are not these hard and fast, this is this and that is that. Especially when you're dealing with high-tech figures, they are very adept at pulling lots and lots of different threads and stitching together things that work to their interests. And we'll conclude with a discussion of what kinds of threats do authoritarian technocrats pose. So in the beginning, for very specific reasons, Silicon Valley became the origin point for the high-tech industry, and there were a number of reasons for that. Of course, unsurprisingly, among the forces that shaped the high-tech industry was the Cold War. And it should not surprise anyone that the origins of Silicon Valley come out from the military-industrial academic complex that emerged in America's kind of waging of the Cold War. So the first and main customers of high-tech was the Department of Defense. There's a really great book by a University of Washington history professor named Margaret O'Mara called The Code. The subtitle is Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. It was a 2019 book, and it charts the emergence of the Silicon Valley tech industry over 4 generations and how a fairly coherent and tightly knit group of largely men used electronic engineering talent and other computer savvy that was largely accrued at Stanford University to develop one of the most lucrative industries in history, and how that engine of unimaginable wealth came largely from government contracts and the federal government's seemingly inexhaustible thirst for technology. So one thing that happened was, that the contracting process for the federal government in this period was highly decentralized, and that really tended to promote a great deal of entrepreneurship. Part of the reason why Silicon Valley became ground zero in the starting point of the high-tech industry is that California had a prohibition on non-compete clauses. Now, non-compete clauses are basically saying, if you're working for us and you sign this contract, you can't leave us and then go to work for another firm. And the fact that California had a prohibition on those kinds of contracts fostered incredible spurts of activity. So the mobility in the tech field was established by what were known as the traitorous 8. These were 8 PhD physicists who left the original big tech firm that was run by William Shockley, who had been a Nobel Prize winning physicist, who basically was a bit of an authoritarian, and his management strategy and insistence on pursuing dogmatic lines of inquiry led to the defection of 8 key employees to found what would become known as Fairchild Semiconductor, which would then spin out many of the second generation tech firms like Intel. So again, when you get back to this question of how the tech industry emerged, initially Silicon Valley was the province of white guys with crew cuts. There was a very distinctive Silicon Valley subculture that emerged in the 40s and the 50s. And the picture on this slide is of Michael Douglas from the 1993 movie Falling Down. And it really captured the look of the typical Silicon Valley defense industry mid-level worker of the early period of the formation of the Silicon Valley subculture. Stuart Brand, who was the founder of the Whole Earth Catalog, which we'll talk about more later in this presentation, he was a cult figure among the tech industry types in the 1970s and 80s. He noted that most of the real engineering was done with people with narrow ties who worked 9 to 5, often with federal money. In the 1970s, of course, you had the emergence of sort of the hippie culture that a lot of people tend to equate Silicon Valley with today. O'Mara, in the book, describes this initial culture as profanity-laced, chain-smoking, hard-drinking hybrid of locker room, Marine barracks, and scientific lab. The absence of women within this subculture originates in this period both when women in electronics were presumed not to mix and when the dominant figures in these fields were decidedly uninterested in hiring women. Another significant government act that really shapes the current nature of Silicon Valley was the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. That really facilitated the influx of foreign-born people into this country, many of whom were recruited by the big universities like Stanford. And again, today, more than half of the founding members of Silicon Valley companies from 1995 to 2005 were born outside the United States. And so in this period, Silicon Valley really initially developed what I characterize as a politically apolitical approach to politics. They wanted to maintain a sense of independence, particularly among Silicon Valley's managerial class, in how they approached Sacramento and how they approached Washington, D.C., because they understood first and foremost that the source of the tech industry's productivity came from government investments. And well into the 1990s, the dominant stance of tech elites was to avoid alienating either political party. And so, this culture really first is captured in an essay that was it was called The Californian Ideology. And it was coined by a British academic by the name of Richard Barbrook and his colleague Andy Cameron in a 1995 paper on the ideology of Silicon Valley, characterizing the California ideology as a fusion of American neoliberalism and often, seemingly incommensurate ideas drawn both from the left and the right. So it was, as described in this essay, it was a fatalistic vision of the natural and inevitable triumph of the high-tech free market, whose politics appeared to be impeccably libertarian. And we've spoken about libertarian in this class. This is really the idea of of individualism pushed to its logical extreme. It was this initial culture was at once pro-business, libertarian, and culturally progressive. So in its early form, the Californian ideology reflected the post-Cold War era in which it was conceived. Silicon Valley's ideology was pro-market, but not pro-liberty. They were highly, highly collectivist. And what that really means is that the high-tech industry always wanted a government that could do things. especially a government that could award them huge contracts. But they didn't want government that would impose regulations on their industry. And so you have this dominant libertarian ideological perspective, which, nevertheless, there was a long-standing relationship between the tech industry and the Democratic Party, in no small part because the Democratic Party in the 1980s was the party that was most generous in terms of advancing the investments in the high-tech industry. Al Gore got a lot of grief in the 2000 election by saying, "I invented the internet." That's not what he meant, and what ultimately he meant, though, was as a senator, he had led the way in the creation and the marketization of the internet, which, no one should forget that the internet is the lifeblood of the high-tech industry. And so there's a long-standing relationship between the tech industry and the Democratic Party. There is nevertheless deep hostility, especially among the founder class and the investor class, in any kind of federal regulation of the tech industry, and also in consumer protection. In particular, the Section 230 of Federal Telecommunications Act. They do not want to be opened up to lawsuits because of the things that are happening on their websites. So again, deep hostility to worker protections. As a group, the tech industry was among the hardest to pigeonhole among partisan lines in the 90s and into the early aughts. So again, while surveys and interviews would suggest that most tech founders were socially liberal, they all strongly supported gay marriage, immigration, higher taxes on the wealthy, universal health care, more generous federal welfare spending. These are all the hallmarks of a democratic group of people. But they were also, again, they did not want anyone looking into their business. So it's also important to keep in mind of this notion of factionalization and ultimately centralization that would occur among the various industry factions in the high-tech industry. And one of the first is, of course, the PayPal mafia. This was a byproduct of the dot-com bust of 2001. This was a situation where consumer-based internet companies proliferated in the aftermath of the dot-com bust, which was, again, an investment bubble where you had overinvestment in frequently unproductive tech products, which initially inflated the stock market by 80%, but then dropped over the course of 2001 by almost the same amount. So one of these early consumer-based companies was, of course, PayPal, which was a money transfer service purchased by eBay in 2002 for $1.5 billion. Again, it was comparable to the Intel founding in terms of how many lucrative spin-offs would come from the tech, from this one area. Key members of the PayPal mafia, especially Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, both of whom are, Musk is from South Africa. I can't remember where Thiel is from. Cultivated kinds of a cult of personality around themselves as geniuses and great founders of tech companies. Several subsequent mafia families have emerged, again, at the top of the tech industry. And it's, why do we call them mafia? Well, first and foremost, because they are highly hierarchical in nature, right? The founders of these tech companies receive a degree of deference that is usually you would find reserved for heads of mafia families. There are 11 these days that they describe when you look at the internet and say, what are the mafia families of Silicon Valley? There are 11 of them. Their combined worth, the key ones are Google, McKinsey, Microsoft, Twitter, Tesla, OpenAI, Oracle, Amazon, Alibaba, IBM, and Qualcomm. Their combined worth is around $590 billion distributed over 9,700 companies. the shared educational background of Silicon Valley's top leaders. They were all trained at Stanford and the University of Illinois, Chicago, or Illinois' Urbana-Champaign campuses. The fact that so many tech entrepreneurs came from those two large universities is a byproduct of politics. Al Gore Jr. again, was instrumental in the creation of ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet. And in the process of steering research dollars, they focused on 4 universities, 2 of which were Stanford and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The other 2 were UCLA and the University of California at Santa Barbara. And so again, it shouldn't be a shock that to the extent that there was a derangement in where these folks were coming from, government investments had a big part to play in it. These families form loose networks that frequently collaborate, and again, they exert exceptional control over what the tech industry does and is doing and thinking about at any particular point in time. The concentration of power and influence over an industry that constitutes roughly 10% of U.S. GDP and $3.7 trillion of gross output, again, is instructive. The point of the mafia label for these networks is that they are highly elitist, male-dominated, and fairly insular. They're not insulated from one another, but they are insular sort of from the outside world. What you're also seeing within this group are highly divergent political viewpoints that are emerging. Again, while I mentioned that a lot of people in the tech industry are progressive on a lot of issues, there are a number that have, distinctively what I would consider to be conservative ideological perspectives. And again, while key members of the tech industry have been drifting to the right, the rank and file members of the tech industry remain liberal. And again, 70% of Silicon Valley voted for Kamala Harris in 2024. Some tech CEOs explain that by basically arguing that the young people at universities have been radicalized. This is the view offered by the tech billionaire Marc Andreessen in a January New York Times interview with Ross Douthat. Again, he basically makes the argument that all these schools where these folks are learning the skills that cause them to be hired by Silicon Valley are also instilling in them these radicalized left-wing views that are basically saying capitalism is bad, we should burn the whole thing down. Now, I frankly think that view is divorced from reality. I don't think there are that many people working in high tech that have drifted well beyond what I think most people would consider to be mainstream liberal views. And it's instructive that someone like Andreessen would make that kind of characterization of the rank and file workers within his own industry. For their part, people working in the tech industry have increasingly expressed ambivalent attitudes toward many of their bosses, complaining of micromanagement and unreasonable work demands. Elon Musk in particular has been accused of cultivating a super intense work environment and punishing workers who refuse to work, put in 80-hour work weeks. Anybody that tries to balance life and work is viewed by Elon Musk as not a good employee. Silicon Valley workers increasingly report fear of retaliation for public disagreements with those certain of those bosses in Silicon Valley. So let's talk a little bit about the intellectual influences of, especially this particular group of what I'm characterizing as authoritarian technocrats. So it's very important to recognize that the things we read for fun are important. What you read when you don't have to shapes how you will act. And one of the things that's widely been acknowledged, even within the industry, is the significance of science fiction and fantasy over especially key figures. One of the books that is often, or one of the sets of books that is often cited, is The Lord of the Rings, which is a trilogy. There was a prequel called The Hobbit. There is broad appeal for J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy series within Silicon Valley, both inside and outside of this particular faction that we're talking about. There is a nostalgia that tends to be embedded in fantasy, hearkening back to a time of magic when nature, had a hold over humanity. That has, kind of influenced a revival of traditionalist schools of thought. The key elements of traditionalism is that humanity is currently caught in a dark age, which we'll talk about more when we get to our presentations on radical Islam. Humanity is caught in a dark age caused by modernity and globalization. According to traditionalists, modernity has stripped humanity of its moral traditions, replacing those traditions with individualism, materialism, and consumerism. Traditionally, which is ironic that so many people in Silicon Valley are enthralled by these books, given that so many of these folks are in the business of producing the next big thing that will then replace the last big thing. Traditionalism often evidences anti-rationalism, arguing for esoteric, which is a fancy word for secret and so specialized as to be unknown, so specialized bodies of knowledge as to be unknown by those who are not initiates in that particular body of knowledge. And again, the argument being the sources of meaning are somehow obscured. Traditionalism has had a political revival in Russia. Where Alexander Dugin, a Russian philosopher, and has been a close confidant of Vladimir Putin, and has advocated for a brand of Russian hyper-nationalism and revival of old believer interpretations of Eastern Orthodox Christianity that, again, emphasize Russian greatness and likely were, profound influences on Russia's decision or Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. If you know anything about the Lord of the Rings, you know that it's both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the three books, are basically journey books. They're talk about the importance of a hero's journey. And Silicon Valley elites have a tendency to emphasize those kinds of heroic icons. Both the prequel and The Lord of the Rings revolve around a quest where the protagonist and allies undertake a dangerous journey in pursuit of some important goal. The books are also ruminations on power in the form of magic rings, and the One Ring devised by Sauron, who was the principal antagonist of the books, as a weapon to subjugate the realms of Middle-earth, which was the setting of the books. The protagonist of The Lord of the Rings, Frodo Baggins, is the possessor of the One Ring and must undertake a dangerous journey into the heart of Mordor, which is Sauron's stronghold, to destroy the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom. That sort of brief synopsis again suggests something paradoxical, that the people of Silicon Valley are the ring creators, but nevertheless they find these books to be sources of enormous influence. And so part of the reason for that is just, again, harkens back to the origin point of the origin point of Silicon Valley, and especially in the countercultural period of the 1960s. Oftentimes, hacker culture is identified as these insurgents, the hackers as hobbits kind of image. In The Lord of the Rings, the hobbits are the smallest people but can become the biggest heroes. In Silicon Valley of the 60s and 70s, a lot of these smaller companies were going up against these huge impersonal companies like IBM. And so the tendency of Silicon Valley CEOs has been to name many of their company spin-offs after Lord of the Rings concepts and places. Peter Thiel has named his AI-driven data mining and analysis company Palantir, which is named after the indestructible crystal spheres that enabled its owners to see events and locations from the past or the future. Thiel also named a long-term venture capital firm Mithril Capital, which is the magic lightweight metal that's used to make weapons and armor in Middle-earth. In 2019, Peter Thiel's protege, J.D. Vance, named his venture capital firm that he briefly led Narya, which was one of the 3 magic elven rings and was the ring worn by one of the main protagonists of the book, the wizard Gandalf. Another example of this tendency is Palmer Luckey, another Silicon Valley authoritarian technocrat, naming his startup military defense technology company Anduril Industries, which was named after the legendary reforged sword of the king of Arnor and Gondor. So what these guys oftentimes seem to miss is the extent to which the Lord of the Rings is a kind of cautionary tale. Tolkien draws on his experiences from the trenches of France in World War I to conjure the horrors of war and the exertion of raw power. Mordor, Tolkien very unapologetically said, was a metaphor for industrialization. He had an instinctive aversion to what he characterized as machine worshippers. And various of the Lord of the Rings characters' fates serve as a warning against the temptations of unlimited power. One of the minor antagonists, Gollum, a hobbit debased by the long ownership of the One Ring, who became the principal vehicle for the ring's destruction, is illustrative of how power can deform the soul. Other characters in the Lord of the Rings rise or fall based on how they resist the allure of the ring. The Gondorian prince Boromir fails the test and attempts to take the ring from Frodo and is subsequently killed by servants of Sauron, while his brother Faramir nobly resists the temptation to take the ring and survives to become a great ally of Aragorn, the rightful king of Arnor and Gondor. Aragorn and Gandalf, the two of the more important protagonists, similarly resist the temptation to take the One Ring, understanding that its use, even for good, would inevitably turn them to evil. The same resistance, occurs with the Elven queen Galadriel, who very dramatically refuses to accept Frodo's offer to give her the ring for the same reason. She knows she would be great, she would do great things, and then she would turn inevitably to evil. Other science fiction books also, and I would note that just about all the science fiction that these guys seem to cite and say, I really have been influenced by this book, they're all dystopian novels. Neal Stephenson's Snow Crash, 1992 book, offers a dystopic vision of an anarcho-capitalist future. Now, what does anarcho-capitalism mean? It means there is no central power governing the United States and other countries of the world, but nevertheless, capitalism remains, a central aspect of how the world revolves. Neal Stephenson himself is a well-established science fiction and speculative fiction writer. Snow Crash was his breakout novel. Stevenson's writing has influenced the development of virtual reality, and he acted as a futurist consultant for technology companies like Blue Origin and Magic Leap. So in the book, government incompetence leads to hyperinflation, and sovereignty has devolved into enclaves of corporations and organized crime. And it's very difficult to determine the difference between the two. The protagonist is a freelance hacker who delivers pizzas for the mafia. The plot line weaves elements of computer science, linguistics, ancient history, cryptology, and religion. Stevenson is responsible for coining the term the metaverse. There is speculation that Mark Zuckerberg's decision to change the name of Facebook to Meta is evidence of Stevenson's influence. And again, ask yourself why a dystopic steampunk fiction book like this occupies such a prominent space on authoritarian technocrats' reading lists. Another Stevenson book, Diamond Age, again posits a world transformed by nanotechnology. Again, it's a world dominated by tribes. Diamond Age won the 1996 Hugo Award for Best Science Fiction Novel. The Hugo Award it's like the Oscar for actors. In this book, again, you have the plight of unaffiliated Thetes in a corporate oligarchy characterized by, it's a joke where they talk about post-scarcity. And again, it's a coming-of-age story that addresses the themes of education, social class, and the potential for artificial intelligence. And the main theme of the book is that it explores the education of a character named Nell and two other girls under the tutelage of an interactive primer that's designed to steer its readers toward a more interesting life. And again, for many, Stevenson is positing a world where nation states have ceased to meaningfully exist. And that's clearly a vision that is deeply attractive to many of these Silicon Valley types, especially of a more authoritarian bent. Nonfiction books that are often included in the Silicon Valley canon include Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, which is a 1976 book in kind of philosophy, arguing that human beings or that animals are basically survival machines that work to guarantee their perpetuation. And basically, he makes the argument that even altruistic acts are really should be judged as selfishness. And again, the Silicon Valley ideology often applies Dawkins' use of biological metaphors to the field of technology. And again, there is a belief among certain technological types that innovations, that the constant churn of the high-tech industry reflects sort of the survival of the fittest theory that informed a lot of social Darwinism. Dawkins' arguments have appeared to influence arguments justifying disruption within the tech industry, positing, again, a hyper-competitive business environment where only the most ruthless companies survive. That line of argument justifies, again, the establishment of a hard-driving business culture of long hours and where the sacrifice of employees' interests and well-beings to the needs of the company is justified by the fact that the company itself is under what they would characterize as existential threat. Finally, the argument dismisses ideas like empathy and altruism as clever disguises. I mentioned the one guy, the guy who wrote Whole Earth Catalog. It was first published in 1966 as a sort of counterculture catalog of tools that could be used to start your own commune. You can understand why this would be attractive in the early part of the formation of Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs, of course, one of the founding member of Apple, basically would say the Whole Earth Catalog was a sort of Google in paperback form before Google came along. It provided a pre-internet template for a user-generated content for individual empowerment. And again, it reflected that more counterculture libertarian strain within Silicon Valley in the 1970s, which was a formative period of the industry, and as younger generation of founders like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Paul Allen began companies that would produce a great deal of the wealth on which today's companies rest. So the spirit of the catalog, irreverence towards institutions, its emphasis on autodidacticism, which basically just refers to the idea of self-education, and its sunny view of computers as tools of personal liberation appealed to a younger generation of technologists. And again, several members of the Silicon Valley tech conservative movement have excoriated public education as a form of liberal indoctrination. Peter Thiel, for example, has taken his rejection of formal education further, paying young people to drop out of college to work in technological fields. Several recipients of Thiel's scholarship program were part of Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency program. Another important book is James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State. I have that book on my bookshelf. I am a big fan of James C. Scott's work. It's a criticism of sort of modern versions of the state. James C. Scott was a Yale political anthropologist who specialized in comparative anthropology. One of his early books, Weapons of the Weak, explored the strategies employed by Malaysian peasants to fight back against powerful landlords when they violate when they would violate long-held economic arrangements. Scott would argue that the tendency of governments to adopt sort of dogmatic approaches and the dogmatic application of science and technology to social problems oftentimes produced horrible results. So ideas that look good on paper or in theory, but are insensitive to the real world consequences of what was going on, oftentimes created really horrible outcomes. And so, the essence of Scott's argument is that if you're ignoring the importance of metis, which is, it refers to practical knowledge derived from experience and shaped by specific context, in favor of epistemic knowledge, which refers to book learning and formalized bodies of knowledge associated with scientific methods and institutional education where you're earning a degree, that can actually turn out badly. And so one of the big examples that Scott adduces is the consequences of scientific forestry. In Europe, the tendency of the state was to view forests primarily in economic terms, as in how much timber could be extracted from a given area. In Germany, they came upon the idea of clear-cutting entire regions of forest and replanting them at regular intervals with the Norway spruce, which was the most productive type of tree for the purposes of selling timber. But such a narrow frame of reference left out important considerations. And in the short run, while the experiment was a success, in the long term, thinning out the undergrowth contributed to soil depletion, to the clearing of underbrush deprived local villages of access to medicinal herbs that they had relied on for their individual health. And so the result was, again, short term, great productive. We're getting a lot of timber out of these forests, but the forests themselves are dying, and they're not producing the things that the local people need. Another very important book, and I'll talk about, I think, one more, is the idea, the book that's called The Sovereign Individual by James Dale Davidson. It offered a kind of prophetic vision of the end of the nation state. James Dale Davidson and Lord William Rees-Mogg described this as sort of the fourth stage of human society. And as a shift in the dynamics between state power and individual autonomy. They posited that, as people become more wealthy, certain people will grow more and more autonomous, and the power and the influence of states will decline. And so the rise of information society will unleash human creativity and facilitate the accumulation of individual sovereign wealth. And we're seeing this today. I honestly believe that Elon Musk's and other tech billionaires' pursuit of becoming a trillionaire is derived by their intent to become nation states unto themselves. The last one I'll talk about is, I got one more, is the idea of superintelligence, which was Nick Bostrom's book, and Bostrom is an author that Silicon Valley tech authoritarians oftentimes cite his work. And it's basically it's a speculation on when human-level AI will be developed. Bostrom basically makes the argument, once you get to that plateau, he believed that superintelligent systems will not be far behind. Right now we're talking about this. We're talking about artificial intelligence that could become instantly far more intelligent than any individual or any group of individuals. Now the problem with this is, and with any technology, is that there are going to be difficulties that are going to be inherent in controlling such a system. If you look at the title of the book, or the cover of the book, It's based on what was known as the unfinished fable of the sparrows, which is an analogy. And in this fable, a group of sparrows decide to seek and find and raise an owl from the egg to serve as their servant. The sparrows believe that life will be easy with an owl servant. They'll be able, the owl will be able to find food for them and will protect them from predators and give them, abundant spare time for leisure. But one owl, or one, sparrow basically says, how are we going to tame this owl? How are we going to be sure that the owl's not going to resort to instinct and eat us? And the fact that it's unfinished is, again, suggestive. And again, it points to one of the real dangers that is present, in the things that the high-tech industry are doing today. The last one I'm going to talk about in terms of the books is the is this book called Masters of Doom. It's a book by David Kushner, and it's basically about ID Software and the co-founders' influence on the gaming industry through their popular game Doom. It's basically what they call the story of the two Johns, co-founders John Carmack and John Romero, and the corporate culture that contributed to their success. The contrasting personalities of the two founders. Romero was described as super creative and skilled, but cultivated a rock star persona that caused him to lose focus, while Carmack, in contrast, was described as more introverted, but developed, many of the gaming, of the company's game engines, the engines that enabled these games to work. Kushner characterized Carmack as sort of the indispensable founder. And the problem is, while the two together initially succeeded, the conflicts between the two would ultimately drive the company apart, and ultimately Romero would leave. And it basically, Romero's departure from ID Software to found Ion Storm, and the problems that emerge in both companies subsequently really reveals the importance of culture, right? Carmack developed an increasingly demanding approach that led many ID Software folks to say that it wasn't a fun place to work. In contrast, Romero cultivated a fun place to work where game design was law, but whose lack of management and organizational skill led to disastrous financial results for Ion Storm's investors. And so, this is sort of a cautionary tale that you have to have, you have to have a sound business strategy, and you also have to have that creativity to innovate. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the technocracy movement, because right now we're talking about speculative influences on Silicon Valley. This is actually a historical thing that happened in the early 20th century. There was actually a technocracy movement in the United States and Canada and a few other places. And Elon Musk's grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, was a leader of that movement in Canada. And basically the technocracy movement, and again, remember in the Great Depression, democracy was not really well thought of at the time. And the argument of these, what they called themselves technocrats, was that you would get rid of democratically elected officials and you would replace them with scientists and engineers. So this is sort of the ultimate, kind of meritocratic argument. We wouldn't need popular elections anymore because competent people would be, governing us in a disinterested manner. The problem, of course, was that technocracy lacked a theory for the assumption of power. There was no theory of how technocracy would replace democracy. And the movement took increasingly bizarre turns. There's a photo on this slide about, at some point they all began wearing gray suits, which kind of looked a lot kind of fascist-like. Ultimately, Canada determined that the technocracy movement was a threat to the Constitution and basically banned them. Haldeman was turned away at the U.S. border. He was due to come to the United States to issue a series of speeches on technocracy. He was viewed as a threat to public safety. Haldeman eventually emigrated to South Africa in 1948. 1948 is a very important year because that was the year that the South African government instituted the apartheid government. That this guy was attracted to a government based on racial segregation should tell you everything you need to know about, at least that person within the technocracy movement. Ultimately, technocracy just kind of disassembled at some point. One final guy that I'll talk about is Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin is a computer programmer turned blogger turned podcaster. He has condemned democracy as failed and weak. He has argued for a monarchy along the lines of how Silicon Valley founders are established. He wants to gut federal bureaucratic agencies. RAGE is what it's an acronym for, Retire All Government Employees. This is something that has obviously exerted considerable influence within the Trump administration. And in fact, Curtis Yarvin, his name has been mentioned by J.D. Vance as someone who has influenced him. And he has increasingly been cited approvingly by Silicon Valley CEOs and GOP politicians. And he was at Trump's inauguration. So what is it that Silicon Valley's conservatives want? There are a mix of economic and political motivations that appear to be motivating the rightward shift of certain Silicon Valley founders and investors. And again, I should note, there are certain members of Silicon Valley that were more liberal and that have remained liberal, that voted for Kamala Harris and that wrote very large checks to Kamala Harris's campaign. So what do they want? How do Silicon Valley's conservatives view politics? How is the conservatism of Silicon Valley CEOs and founders, how does it fit within the broader framework of conservative ideologies? The first question we have to ask is, are these transferable skills? Are the skills that enable Elon Musk to found a bunch of companies, and he's hired, good people. He's done certain things that are very considered to be, that make him in many ways, a lot of people view him as one of the great tech innovators of our generation. But strictly speaking, one thing, it's mythical to say that Silicon Valley's conservatives and investors were apolitical or innocent of politics. Key investors have been very adept at lobbying Washington and Sacramento for policies favorable to the industry for a very long time. They've been especially adept at evading regulation and any form of labor protections. If you can remember, or you want to Google, Mark Zuckerberg's, appearances before Congress, he is a classic Silicon Valley guy. There is also a relative lack of basic understanding of government. Silicon Valley's a long way from the Capitol, and for a long time, Silicon Valley's leaders kept themselves apart from politics, aside from campaign contributions where they typically kind of played both sides of the street. However, the recent, direct involvement of certain Silicon Valley titans, especially Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, offer evidence that the tech industry's managerial class paid relatively little attention to American politics in their self-readings or anything else. Peter Thiel is trained as a lawyer. He's not a technologist, but he has a demonstrated hostility to America's constitutional regime. Likewise, Elon Musk, for all his talent at putting together technology companies, including SpaceX, Starlink, and Tesla, has also made comments on basic facts related to American government that betray a genuine ignorance. When he went into the White House and basically said, we have a choice between bureaucracy and democracy, that betrays a fundamental ignorance of how modern democracy works. Bureaucratic agencies are part of our constitutional structure. He's basically advocating breaking things, in my view, in ways that are unlawful. Move fast and break things is a phrase attributed to Mark Zuckerberg in emphasizing speed and experimentation. In a competitive environment, it's better, the argument is it's better to make mistakes than to get bogged down. And in the tech field, innovation is king and disruption is the watchword. The Department of Government Efficiency is an example of how the tech industry views government. And again, from the perspective of tech, conservatives, the biggest threat to innovation is bureaucracy, because bureaucracy would be what would ultimately be regulating them. So they're basically preemptively destroying the very things that would ultimately be the ones to call them to account. DOGE's rapid infiltration and seizure of computer systems is a perfect example, illustration of the principle of move fast and break things applied to politics. DOGE reflects an engineer's approach to the problem of optimizing government. But DOGE was fundamentally an exercise in a particular kind of engineering, that of demolition, not of, making things better. Musk's purchase of Twitter followed a very similar pattern. Upon the purchase of Twitter, Musk immediately began making massive changes, laying off a significant proportion of Twitter's workforce, eliminating content moderation and relying instead on self-reporting, and moving or attempting to move to a subscription model to offset the revenue losses from the loss of advertising. Musk was additionally accused of erratic management, abruptly changing the name of Twitter to X and using the social media platform far more aggressively than previous Twitter management to advance his own particularly ideological views. He also changed the algorithms to push more conservative voices to the forefront and to throttle views which he personally disagreed. Lots of people left X when those changes took place. The changes Musk has made has seriously eroded the market value of X, which he initially purchased for $44 billion and has lost billions in advertising revenue and traffic. And frankly, though its market value is not much different today, that's only because Musk himself has sunk billions into it to offset those costs. The idea of a fork in the road is oftentimes, kind of a watchword, especially among folks like Elon Musk. And again, it posits this idea of existential threats as a justification for their accumulation of unprecedented wealth. Significant motivation for Elon Musk's escalating compensation demands. Keep in mind, right now, Tesla has a compensation package worth nearly $1 trillion that they're offering to Musk for him to basically concentrate just on Tesla. Okay? And I would argue there is no way that Elon Musk, even if he dropped everything, that he could generate $1 trillion worth of wealth for Tesla. So ask yourself why Tesla's board is doing that. And a big part of the reason why Musk wants to become a trillionaire is he wants to go to Mars. He wants to go to Mars and colonize it. He wants to lead his own little idyllic utopian community where he would be the guy, founder in space. Imagine how that would work out for the people that follow him. There's another concept that's very important in Silicon Valley, and that is the idea of long-termerism. And that is long-termerism, it has a kind of vague relationship to effective altruism, which is a worldview of Peter Singer, arguing that wealthy people in societies have a moral obligation to fight poverty, even poverty far removed geographically, and that encourages a utilitarian greatest good for the greatest number of people kind of view. Long-termerism significantly extends the timeline of effective altruism, arguing that the privileged have a similar moral obligation to secure humanity's collective well-being for decades or even millennia to come. Long-termers believe humanity needs to be prepared to survive any number of species-eradicating events, such as a massive asteroid strike or a global pandemic. The preparation in long-termer views is more important than combating poverty here and now. So long-termers like Musk, repeatedly couch, what they're doing in terms of we face an existential threat. Humanity is in a race against time. At some point, the sun is going to explode. We need to be able to get out of here. In order to do that, we've got to drop everything. And the poor are just, it's too bad. Tragic outcome. And in fact, there are various existential threats that are driving Silicon Valley's conservatism. And again, for Musk, the threat of population collapse due to low birth rates is a much bigger threat for him than global warming, which is why he has fathered an improbably large number of children, 14 at current count, by at least 4 different women. Many of these threats are threats of Silicon Valley's own making. The threat of AI, which many people acknowledge, many of these tech conservatives acknowledge, may be a bigger threat than the development of atomic weapons. And yet, they're in a heedless and headlong race to try and achieve superintelligence without thinking through the ethical consequences. System optimization is oftentimes a watchword for the tech industry. And again, that tends to lead to a focus on productivity metrics over the broader norms of democratic deliberation. The focus on, there's a really good book by Rob Reich and 2 other authors called System Error, where big tech went wrong and how to reboot. It's a 2021 book. And the authors argue that the urge for system optimization leads people steeped in tech culture to prefer disruption over democracy. Reich himself recounts being visited by a group of important and influential people at the top of the Silicon Valleys to address a group on the subject. And the subject was, what was this group of entrepreneurs' vision of their ideal society? How do you work towards such an idealized society? In the midst of that, he asked the group whether they want some degree of democracy. And he replies, he was met with silence and blank stares. Reich has elsewhere noted this contempt for democracy and preference for technocratic solutions over democratic solutions among some of the tech industry's biggest, most influential voices. And so again, this reflects a serious concern that there is a significant and powerful faction within an enormously consequential industry that really doesn't believe in the American Constitution or in democratic Republican governance. This is illustrated, and from the earliest point. Mark Zuckerberg is often considered some kind of this nerdy person. From the very start, one of the mantras of Facebook was company over country. Their insistence was on, developing market share and developing, and growing the company. And when their internal research showed that Instagram, which was a software program that they purchased, was hurting people, they didn't care and they suppressed the research. So it's quite frequent that these technocrats use the language of the Enlightenment to justify a fundamentally anti-democratic and illiberal political movement. And again, when you think about, algorithmic amplification, the fact that they have the ability to manipulate the algorithms, to advance certain messages and suppress others, and the proliferation of misinformation that's damaging democratic norms, as well as the use of misinformation on social media to suppress targeted views. They can sit there and say, we had nothing to do with that. We didn't do that. But they're facilitating it. The platforms they're using are helping to do these things to damage democratic norms and democratic institutions. You also have the role that American technology companies have played in the construction of the surveillance state in China, and also the big investment bets that they've made in China. These folks, especially Elon Musk, have invested billions of dollars in China. And that's a guy that was about to get a security briefing on China from the Defense Department. Are these folks post-democratic? Patently so. Peter Thiel in 2009 at a Cato Unbound conference address basically said, I no longer believe freedom and democracy are compatible. In another interview with Ross Douthat, he basically said, he's terrified that Greta Thunberg would be more likely to become a dictator than that he would. And he has at various points, basically explained that the expansion of the franchise, the expansion of voting to different groups of people is a major cause of democracy stagnation. Ask yourself, which group of people does he think has somehow led to democracy stagnation, has effectively undermined democracy? Is it blacks? Is it women? Is it young people? This is a guy, Peter Thiel also, that basically was talking about escaping. He was going to basically set up a state in the middle of the ocean and rely on cryptocurrency and basically just live in a society of his own making. Again, just like Elon Musk, these are people who want to rule their own little worlds. This is incredibly solipsistic. The extent to which this group of people in particular is engaged in a kind of groupthink is, to me, really obvious. What do these folks want? They also talk very frequently about this idea of transhuman, about augmenting humanity with the insertion of technology into people's brains, with, again, technological solutions to the limitations of humanity. Radical enhancement of human cognitive capacity, health and lifespans, and a possible post-human, world. These folks, the folks that are included in this particular group, that are, basically toying with this idea of, of a post-human world, include Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel. What could go wrong? Critics of transhumanism include traditional conservatives who worry about, here's a book that you ought to include in their reading list, Frankenstein, the subtitle of which is Prometheus Unbound. The idea that human beings attempting to defeat death could lead to bad outcomes. Conservatives worry about the possibility of using technology to augment human beings. There are concerns about transhumanism also being leveled from the left, including the possibility that such augmentation might be done coercively. Or alternatively, that access to life-enhancing technologies would only be available to those with extraordinary access to wealth. Transhumanism for me, something else for thee. Critics also worry about the social consequences of such life-enhancing and expanding technologies that haven't been adequately explored. So authoritarian technology or technocracy as an ideology. How does it work as an ideology? Think about it from the perspective that we were talking about in these four basic approaches that we talked about in our earlier presentations. What does it explain? Society is viewed through the prism of technology, right? How does it evaluate the world? If a society is good when technology is effectively employed for the improvement of society, when it's not otherwise. Any kind of regulation would be a bad thing. Orientation. The world is effectively divided into the producers and the consumers of technology. And consumers do not have any right to ask anything of the producers. The producers are founders beyond criticism. Program. Unregulated development of artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency and whatever the next big thing will be. Again, heedless of the consequences that might come from this. How do authoritarian technocrats view human nature? Now, this is the most dramatic departure from most conservative views of human nature, because for authoritarian technocrats, they appear to give evidence that they believe that humanity is infinitely perfectible. But they often adopt dystopic Nietzschean views of human nature. So for authoritarian technocrats, human nature is divided into those of overwhelming talent, whose creative talent and genius enable them to dominate, and the rest of humanity who are sheep and whose place is to submit to the founder's will and buy their products. Again, libertarianism for them, feudalism for everyone else. How do authoritarian technocrats view freedom? The agent is themselves. This is, again, a very solipsistic view of what they're talking about. The obstacle, government, bureaucracy, democracy. What is the goal? They want to create their own little worlds. They want to be able to do whatever they want with whomever they want to whatever purpose. They want to become gods. This is an incredibly hubristic group of people. How big a threat is posed by authoritarian technocracy? Threat to what? I mean, let's talk about it. Are they good neighbors? We know from reporting that wherever these people take up their living, there is constant disruption. Neighbors are continually complaining. Because going back again to the 1990s when Bill Gates built a 40,000 square foot home, somebody else in the technology industry had to build a 50,000 square foot home. You had to have a 5,000 square foot master bathroom with a waterfall in it. What does that have the effect of doing? Those people around them suddenly find their housing prices going up. They oftentimes complain that local governments give these billionaires preferential treatment because in American government, politics talks, and at the local level, it's even more magnified. And then you have the reality that these folks are making, especially when it comes to AI and space exploration, these folks are making enormous bets on battery powers, and for that they need enormous access to water and enormous access to electricity. And there's widespread reporting that all the rocket launches in southeast Texas that Elon Musk is doing is going to have some pretty long-term, ecological damage to those areas. Think about the conflicts of interest. Again, there is a growing entanglement of Silicon Valley's conservatives with the Trump administration. Trump's AI crypto czar, David Sacks, he's a private businessman who is benefiting from his use of governmental authority. The Trump administration has now purchased $10 billion in shares in Intel. The government is now imposing conditions on the sale of microchips to China from NVIDIA. And again, part of it is they're insisting on a big part of the proceeds. What are the threats posed by these growing conflicts of interest? Again, Musk's leadership and involvement in Doge is a good illustration of the extent to which these authoritarian technocratic billionaires are acting in ways that are conflicted. Musk joked about feeding USAID into the wood chipper, but he didn't say anything about the tens of billions of dollars in government contracts that his companies were still taking. He claimed he would recuse himself on any issues related to his government's contracts, but there's no evidence that Doge investigated any of those contracts. And I would also note that while Musk was working as a special government employee, he had billions invested in EV and battery manufacturing in China, a major U.S. military and commercial rival. Such a conflict would never have been countenanced in any previous administration. Threats to national security. Again, the basic question is the civil-military divide is being eroded as we speak. You have extensive foreign investment and threats of data theft in many of these companies. You have monopolistic control at the top of the high-tech industry. You know, remember, Elon Musk cut off access, Ukrainian access to Skylink in contravention to what the United States government wanted. The State Department officials had to go and beg him to turn those links back on. I mentioned earlier that you have major social media platforms owned by these billionaires that are spreading misinformation and disinformation. And increasingly, Elon Musk is doing it himself. And then you have the threats posed by artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency. I mean, people are talking about college courses now being taught by AI rather than by teachers. Now, that's a threat to my job. Now, I'm a few years from retirement. I can probably survive if it happens in the normal course of events. But nevertheless, it's a deep concern whether AI really can, reliably perform. And again, people with degrees are not perfect. There are lots of reports about people teaching bad things in classes. That's kind of de rigueur. It's a fraction compared to when you talk about the overall number of college professors and credentialed teachers at the lower levels teaching in schools. It's a tiny fraction. Most teachers do good jobs. Most teachers are conscientious and try to do their jobs to the best of their ability. And then you've got cryptocurrency, which is effectively, in my view, just again an argument for I don't want anyone to know what I'm spending my money on, which means it's really good for people who want to purchase illicit things and who want to do things in ways that may be harmful to other people. Trump earlier called it a scam. Now he's taking billions of dollars in his own cryptocurrency. That to me is enormously dangerous to our basic political norms. So that's my view. And, again, it's just my view as it relates to one aspect of the high-tech industry. I think it's concerning to me that these folks are exerting this much money and have this much power and influence. You can take that with a grain of salt. And that's it for this presentation. When we come back, we're going to take up another important Enlightenment era ideology, and that is socialism. I'll see you next time.